Rest, elevate, no, rice is rest, ice, elevate, rest. 4 letters, am I getting this wrong? So rice, oh my god, not rice, rest, ice, compression, elevation, and that was then implemented into sports, and athletes were then starting to use ice and compression. Probably lesser known is that he came out a few years later, I think 2003, 2013, there's a 3 in there, but he came out and said, actually guys, I'll hold my hand if I got it wrong. You've got to unlearn certain things and be able to say, I made a mistake, or I didn't realize the full truth of the situation, which is what this video is about, because I was using ice and doing my cold therapy and I was not getting the results I thought I was going to get. I actually ended up in more pain.